grading pen. Um,
So, Dr. Smith, how was your weekend?
My weekend was good. It was a pretty good weekend. I got to relax a little bit, not much, maybe a little bit.
Studied.
I watched a lot of football. Yeah.
I studied. Went to events and watched some things about Kennedy.
Yeah.
JFK.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, he's one of the reasons I like him is because he, other than his accomplishments, he helped. He's the one who made it easier for Catholics to become president. You know.
Yeah, he broke through that glass ceiling. That's right. For sure. Yeah.
And I admire him because, like, I'm Catholic, and I know that because of him, if I want to become president when I get older, it'll be easier for me.
Well, the thing about Kennedy.
Another thing was he, there's a speech he gave about, like, what he hoped for the future of America would be, and he, like, one of his accomplishments was, like, his tax cuts for the middle class.
Yeah.
And that was one of the greatest things he's done, was his tax cuts for the middle class. And,
well, our tax rates have jumped around in all kinds of crazy places since then, but...
well, he's been dead for, ever since 60.
I was going to say, we're pushing 60 years here since he was killed.
So,
he's a little before my time, too. Kennedy, you know, there's you know... There's no question that Kennedy is influential in the sense that he marked sort of a shift into a new generation in terms of leadership in this country. You know, he's sort of the post Great Depression, post FDR generation to kind of take over, and
because of him, like and also he had an influence on his vice president LBJ,
which
before LBJ was his vice president, like. You look at LBJ's voting record before Kennedy and the stuff he supported after Kennedy, it's like two different people.
Yeah, Kennedy, see, the thing with Kennedy is what Kennedy wanted to accomplish, to a certain extent he wasn't able to because he was assassinated. And so a lot of what LBJ ended up pushing through, Kennedy had supported.
Yeah.
But LBJ was the man who could get it done. And to be honest with you, if you look at politics at that time, Kennedy might not have been able to get it done. It was LBJ that did it. LBJ had been in the House of Representatives for many years before Kennedy. He had been Speaker. He had a degree of, I guess you would say, authority in Congress, and he knew how Congress worked, and he knew how to get things through Congress. I'm not so sure that Kennedy quite had those chops. I don't know. It's hard to say.
But Kennedy is like the only president who accomplished more after his death, in my opinion, you know?
Well, I get what you're saying.
He's the only president who's really, now, he's my favorite president of like after 1920, you know?
Yeah.
But he, it's kind of amazing how he it's kind of amazing how he accomplished more after his death, which not very many people do.
Yeah. It is pretty remarkable. I'm more of a Polk man myself, but I have reasons for that.
And he also, and Bruce Lee said the key to immortality is living a life worth remembering.
Well, that's the ancient Greeks.
And we talk, but it was also the ancient Chinese as well.
Fair enough.
Also, we have, so even though Kennedy's body is dead, like his memory lives on. We see him in, like, he appeared in movies like Forrest, which of course it wasn't him, it was an actor playing him, but there's so many movies about this guy, you know. He was in an episode of The Crown, you know.
Yeah.
It was an actor playing him.
Well, that has to do with the Camelot legacy. You know, we don't see a whole lot of that stuff with, you know, Gerald Ford or you know, Dwight Eisenhower, but we do see that with Kennedy. Hang on, let's get to the lecture there. When we left off, we were talking about Rome. We're talking about Rome, and we were talking about the Pax Romana. We're talking about the Pax Romana. And the truth is, in terms of just general quality of life, strength of economy, infrastructure, all the things that we would judge a state by, certainly you would rather live during the Pax Romana just about any other time that we've discussed in the ancient world. It is particularly important to understand that that does not mean that the Pax Romana was the wonderful land of Oz. It's still a very harsh, brutal life for most people. There was no shortage of poverty during the Pax Romana, and there's a whole series of contradictions with Roman society, even during this era, which cause us to really question exactly how advanced these people were. And the slavery part of it is probably top of the list. Even during the Pax Romana, slavery was extremely common. And even though there were some steps taken to protect slaves, the reality was life as a slave during the Pax Romana was anything but peaceful and prosperous. We look at the gladiators. Perhaps what makes Rome such a difficult place, even with all of the strength and stability that it had, is the fact that the Romans might have grabbed onto that Greek philosophy a little bit too hard. Remember, the ancient Greeks say you have one life, right? You're going to be here once, and you need to accomplish the most you can accomplish. You need to make a name for yourself. History celebrates the winners. History forgets the losers. And in ancient Rome, that's really all that mattered. Ancient Rome celebrated personal accomplishment. You can become the great Caesar in ancient Rome if you work hard enough to get there. The problem is, if you do not succeed in ancient Rome, if you are a member of the dispossessed, if you are disabled, if you are, dealt a bad hand, which we know many people are going to be dealt, you are worthless in ancient Rome. There is no compassion, there is no empathy, there is no interest in the well-being of the less fortunate. And any society, no matter how stable and prosperous and successful it is going to have a portion of people that fall into that category. In ancient Rome, the people that are down here are, not worthy of respect. It is only the people that accomplish and achieve. And you can understand why a society needs to have a healthy balance of encouraging you to succeed, but at the same time, having a degree of compassion for the rest. And so, if you want to know why living in ancient Rome would probably not be a place you would want to be, it's probably because of that. There's something very disturbing about a society that is perfectly comfortable butchering people in the Colosseum, while at the same time, having all of this success. Be that as it may, not every Roman leader was a Nero or a Caligula. There were Roman leaders that were, at least by the standards of the day, pretty decent people. There was a period in the 2nd century AD where there were 5 emperors that we call the 5 good emperors that, again, probably still rather disturbing by today's standards, some of the things that they did, but they did have a vision for Rome that was at least positive. The last of these was Marcus Aurelius, and Marcus Aurelius was really more of a philosopher than he was an emperor. He's probably the one Roman emperor that we can definitively say would probably have been considered a decent person even today. Even by today's standards, we could say that for the most part, Marcus Aurelius was an all right guy. Not perfect, but almost, in a modern sense, a good leader. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, and we start to see the empire slowly decline after him. Particularly in the West. What do I mean by this? Well, for the most part, this is an economic decline. The general prosperity of the empire slips a little bit each year. The per capita income is slowly going down. Tax revenue is slowly going down. The overall health of the state's economy just is kind of in a slow bleed. What this means, of course, is that we start to see Rome crumble. The tax revenue isn't quite what it was a few years ago, so we're going to put off that bridge repair. We're going to put off that aqueduct repair. We're going to not give the army the raise that they really need. We'll cut a few corners on the equipment that the military gets. You get the idea. And you know, from one year to the next, you might not really see this as much of a problem. Yeah, we can put off the road one more year. You know, yeah, they can stretch those swords and shields, you know, through one more campaign. They'll be all right. It's very difficult to know when you're in the moment that you're even in a declining state, right? You know, next year we'll do better. You know, in 10 years we'll be better off. You know, we have good years and bad years. But the reality is, over the course of a few decades, there's a stark difference. And Rome, 100 years after Marcus Aurelius, still an empire, still, you know, functioning, was starkly worse off than Rome had been in 180. And so it is, you know, Rome didn't collapse. Rome just sort of slowly leaned over, and there you go. Kind of like a wall that is getting eaten by termites. It looks all right, but after so many years, man, you know, you're going to start getting holes in that wall. You're going to start getting holes in that wall. So what's going on? Why did Rome decline economically? Why did Rome run into these problems? Well, first of all, Rome starts to lose its gold. Slowly. Again, we don't know this. You could have probably been born in 180, lived a full life, and never really understood what was going on. But slowly, Rome is losing its supply of gold. More gold is leaving the empire or getting lost in one way or another than is being replenished. And if gold is the currency, that means we have less money. That means we have less money. Rome has what we call an unfavorable balance of trade. More gold is leaving than is coming in. You get the idea. Now, how do we solve this gold shortage? Well, in the 3rd century, in the 200s, Rome is going to try a lot of ways, and they all fail. Rome tries to solve its gold shortage by debasing the currency, you know, making gold coins with lesser metals mixed in. You know, this gold coin will only be, you know, 70% gold and it'll be 30% something else. Now, of course, when you start issuing lesser gold coins, what happens is people expect more, don't they? You know, I'm not gonna take that new coin the same way I would have taken an old one. You got to give me more of them if you want to buy this stuff. It just causes inflation. You know, if you print more money, you end up with inflation. You know, it's just how it goes, right? If you print more money, the value of each individual dollar or gold coin or whatever ends up going down. Rome tried wage controls, you know, forcing people to make certain amounts of gold. That didn't work. Rome tried price controls, forcing people to only charge a certain amount for goods and services. All that did was create a black market. You know, if you're a shoemaker and, you know, you want one coin for each of your shoes, but now those coins aren't worth as much, somebody comes in and says, I want to buy a pair of shoes and here's the gold coin that the law says you have to take, you're going to say, sorry, pal, I don't have any shoes. I'm sorry, I'm fresh out. Come back another time, maybe I'll have some to sell you. Now, if you want to meet me behind the store and we negotiate a real price for those shoes, maybe we can work something out. And that's, you know, a black market is exactly what gets created in that environment. And we know that it was rampant when Rome tried these shenanigans.
So basically they tried socialism.
Well, not socialism, but they tried a degree of economic control that ultimately is not going to work. You know, a degree of economic control that is going to fail. Less gold simply means less prosperity if gold is the currency. It doesn't get more simple than that. So again, if we say 100 years after Marcus Aurelius, Rome is still Rome. It's just that the military doesn't have anywhere near the strength that it had before. You know, soldiers are getting paid less. That means the quality of soldiers is far lower. There is less discipline, less training, less interest in fighting and sacrificing for the glory of Rome. The officers, of course, are far lower in quality than before. This makes it extremely hard for Rome to defend its borders and maintain order. This makes it much harder to defend its borders and maintain order. The Roman infrastructure is, of course, now declining notably. You know, the bridges are no longer full of cracks. The bridges are collapsing. And we don't have the ability to rebuild them because it's too expensive. And of course, we're starting to see a brain drain with that because more people are engaging in more subsistence occupations, and so we don't have the engineers and the smart people to do this kind of work. We see a lot more corruption as a result, because if you're not getting paid what you need, you're willing to take bribes, you're willing to engage in petty crime, you're willing to do other stuff. Roman politicians are once again, willing to take money under the table because they want to maintain their standard of living. And this is particularly true among lower ranking people who aren't rich to begin with. There are other issues that we will see. There are other issues that we will see that get discussed. I don't know that these are true, but they at least need to be mentioned. There was a historian by the name of Edward Gibbon. And he was the first real professional Roman historian. He was the guy that came up with the concept of the Pax Romana. You don't have to write that down, but he was the one who sorted out the Pax Romana. And it's worth noting that modern historians really question the extent to which the Pax Romana concept is valid, because it existed much longer in some areas and was well into decline in others, but neither here nor there. He wrote a book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And one problem that he says emerged, oddly enough, is Christianity. He says Christianity weakened Rome considerably. As Rome is sliding, Christianity is getting stronger, getting wealthier, getting more influential. In the early years of Christianity, Christians were persecuted. They were seen as a threat to Roman power. But of course, Christianity grew. By the 3rd century, Christianity is quite influential, and it's dominant by the 4th century, as Rome is really starting to show its problems. He argues that, in very simple terms, Christians did not make good Romans. Christians would not pay taxes. Christians would not contribute to the well-being of the state. Christians will build beautiful churches, but they will not build bridges and canals. The Christians were perfectly comfortable seeing Rome fall. As far as they were concerned, it is the church that should survive, and their nation, if you will, their national identity aligned more with Christianity than it did Rome. And so Rome declining was not a particularly important priority for them. They'll give all this money to the church, but they won't pay their taxes to Caesar. There are plenty of historians today that think this is nonsense, but worth thinking about. Some think that there was, again, probably not the single cause, but again, speculation. Some think there might have been an environmental problem that contributed to a lot of the issues that we see. You see, Romans used an awful lot of lead. Romans used lead for pipes. They used it for pots and pans, crockery, utensils. Lead is real easy to work with, of course. It's very malleable, very easy to cook with lead. It's a really bad idea because, of course, when lead gets into your system, it causes a lot of neurological problems. And lead poisoning knocks down your IQ. Lead poisoning can cause all kinds of serious mental issues. And the people most likely to use lead in their daily lives during ancient Rome were the educated upper class people, because again, pots, pans, they would have cisterns that piped water into their houses with lead pipes. You get the idea. And some think, a lot of the descriptions that we see of Romans in leadership positions that really seemed very off, a lot of these descriptions fit the modern description of people that have lead poisoning. So I don't know. It's something to think about, right? I have no idea. But I'm a little skeptical of lead poisoning myself. You know, lead was in gasoline when I was a kid, and lead fumes were everywhere, you know, and I'm pretty sure it didn't cause any neurological problems for me. I'm a little skeptical of the lead issue myself. When I was a kid, they had lead in gasoline, their fumes were everywhere. It didn't cause any neurological problems for me. There are ultimately military considerations. There are ultimately military considerations. I mentioned earlier, you know, the military is going to be a big issue. Is going to be a big issue for Rome. It is going to notably decline in its professionalism, its training, its ability to win battles and secure the borders. In 306, Rome gets a new emperor, the Emperor Constantine. Now, he is not a Pax Romana emperor. He is not a Pax Romana emperor. You know, he is considered one of the great emperors of Rome, but he did not rule during the great time. And he was smart enough to understand that something is definitely wrong. You know, he is smart enough to understand 100, 150 years ago, we were far better off than we are now. He got it. You know, it clicked in his head. He is not the first emperor to figure this out. There was an emperor before him named Diocletian that actually kind of got this ball rolling, but too many details. We'll just focus on Constantine. So Rome is definitely slipping. And Constantine wants to fix this. Constantine, you know, wants to bring Rome back. And that was going to be his mission, bring Rome back from this inevitable decline. Because, you know, if Rome goes too far over the edge, if too many bridges collapse and too many aqueducts fail and we lose too many battles, there ain't any coming back. You know, Rome will not be able to recover. He did a couple of things. And again, I am simplifying a more complicated process. But he is mostly, or it is him that is given the most credit for dividing Rome into two empires instead of one. Rome is just simply too big to govern with the resources that we have. You know, the borders are just too expansive. We do not have the military anymore to maintain the borders. It is too expensive to maintain the infrastructure. What we're going to do is divide Rome into two empires instead of one. And there will be two emperors now. And we will be allies, and we will work together, and we will all consider ourselves Roman. But politically, we are now divided. And most importantly, we are divided economically. One side will solve its economic problems. The other side will solve its. Western Rome was where the decline was most obvious. Western Rome is where the Pax Romana is clearly done by the time of Constantine. Eastern Rome is still quite strong. Eastern Rome doing fine. You know, if you were living in Eastern Rome, you would have never really noticed the decline up to this point, or it would have been far less significant. And so if you start to see limbs dying on a tree, you prune the bad ones to save the tree, don't you? You know, you cut off the dying limbs so the rest of the tree can survive. And to an extent, that's what Constantine is doing. He is cutting the Western Empire free so that the Eastern Empire can maintain its strength and not have to solve the West's problems. There was a massive economic drain as Eastern gold was pouring into the West to keep everything going. And Constantine said, forget it, not doing it anymore. He created a new capital at a strategically important point, and it will be, of course, the capital of Constantinople, because he is Constantine. And he moves to the east and becomes the Eastern Emperor. He moves to the east, allowing the West to deal with its own issues. And to tell you the truth, one of the key issues the West has to deal with are the Germans. A big problem for the Romans are the Germans. There are two rivers. There is the Rhine and the Danube. And they represent, sort of, the border between the Romans and the Germans. Between the Romans and the Germans. Or, as the Romans would call them, us and those disgusting, smelly barbarians that we hate so much. The Germans never became part of Rome. Rome tried to conquer the Germans many times. They always failed. And Rome eventually just drew the Rhine and the Danube as borders and said, forget it, we're not messing with these crazy people anymore. Well, having to secure this long border against the Germans was difficult, it was expensive. As a matter of fact, by the time Constantine becomes emperor, the Western army had become so weak that a lot of the soldiers in the Western army were Germans, because Rome cannot recruit enough men among its own ranks to maintain the legions in an effective way. And of course, the Roman officers just hated this. I mean, the Roman officers hated the idea that non-Romans would serve in the Roman legions. You know, the writings from the Roman officers said, you know, there's the officer corps, then there are the rank and file legions, then there are the dogs, then there are the Germans. And we will treat them accordingly, because that is how barbaric these German people are. And they just hated accepting them into the Roman ranks. But of course, that's the only soldiers you can get. That's what you're going to have to accept. The Eastern Army didn't deal with that. The Eastern Army kept its ranks filled with actual Romans. Well, we're going to have a bigger problem emerge. If you think the Germans are a problem, we got another problem emerging. Once we get into the 4th century, the 300s, we are going to start seeing the Huns. We are going to start seeing the Huns. The Huns come from Central Asia. The Huns come from Central Asia. Present-day Mongolia, places like that. They are nomadic. They do not stay in one place for any great length of time. The Mongols will be the people that are descendant from them. And they go all across Central Asia doing the kind of thing that you would expect. Well, the Huns start attacking the Germans. The Huns start attacking the Germans in the 4th century, in the 300s. And there are different Germanic tribes. There are Ostrogoths, for example. There are Visigoths. And in the east, the Huns just start tearing the place up. And they do not conquer and rule. You know, they come in, raid the village, burn everything, rape the horses, ride off on the women. You get the idea. Eventually, the Ostrogoths are more or less crushed. So what do you think the Germans in the West are going to do? If you were a Germanic person living in the West and you know that these Huns continue to come and you don't have the strength to stop them, what do you think you're going to do? How about you go to Rome, right? I know you don't like us, I know we don't like you, but we all got to worry about these Huns. You know, we've all got to worry about these people showing up because you don't want to see what they do. And so, and I will give you some dates here in a minute. And so Rome decided to team up with the Germans. Rome decided that it would ally with the Germans, or at least work with the Germans, with the understanding that they would work together to stop the Huns. And an agreement was made in 376 to permit German refugees to temporarily cross the border into Rome. And oddly enough, this was in Eastern Rome. This was in the far western section of Eastern Rome. And the idea is that they will come across the Danube and we will create some sort of a joint defense and drive the Huns out. Well, what do you think these Germans did once they start moving across the border into Roman land? I got news for you. Refugees never intend to go back. Okay, when people migrate somewhere as refugees, their plan is to stay. And this was a very poorly organized arrangement, and all of a sudden, Germans are flooding into Rome with the permission of the Roman leadership, And once they get into these Roman lands, they start taking it for themselves, conflicting with the locals, causing all kinds of conflicts that we know are going to be associated with this. And so a couple of years later, Rome decided, you're getting out. You got to go. Sorry, we made a mistake. Pack it up, Germans. You got to go back to Germany. And of course, the Germans weren't leaving. I mean, the Germans decided we like it here an awful lot more than we like it where we came from. And so Rome assembles the imperial army to drive the Germans out. Rome assembles the imperial army. If the Germans will not leave, we will make them leave. And in 378, they fought the Battle of Adrianople. In 378, they fought the Battle of Adrianople. And oddly enough, this was the Eastern army that fought them, not the Western army. And the reason is complex, but the Western army, of course, supported the East and said that it would fight the East, but some think the West didn't fight because there were too many Germans in the Western army and they were worried about that. Some think that the West just couldn't get its act together, they didn't show up in time. Whatever the case may be, who do you think won the Battle of Adrianople? The Germans. And it was a resounding German victory. As a matter of fact, the Roman emperor that led the army that was actually at the battle ended up getting killed himself at the battle. It was such a crushing Roman defeat. Now, I am simplifying a more complex process, but the Battle of Adrianople demonstrated to the Germans these Romans are not what we think they are. You know, this is a very fancy wall that has been eaten with termites. All we got to do is hit on it, and it will come down. And the wall, metaphorically, is, of course, that German border. Now, again, I'm not getting into the details, but the Eastern Army got itself together and drove those Germans out a couple of years later. It told the Germans the Roman border is fluid. The Roman border is not defended the way we want it, the way we assume it is. Now, what do you think the empire is going to do now that it realizes we got a problem? The Germans have figured out that we're weaker than we say. We can't realistically keep them out. The empire gets very pragmatic. The Eastern Empire bribes them into going to the West. The Eastern Empire makes the Germans understand the West is a lot weaker than us. Why don't you just go over there? And so the Germans start flooding into the Western Roman Empire. And over the course of several generations, the Western Roman Empire just kind of dissolves. The leaders, the emperors, are forced to simply give up land to the Germans, withdraw its borders further and further south as Germanic tribes come in, take it for themselves, and start establishing new states. Oh, and by the way, we still haven't defeated the Huns. And what do you think the Huns then start to do? The same thing. The Huns start moving into Western Rome as well, raiding up and down. At one point, the Huns even raided up and down Italy itself, and there was very little that the Western Empire could do about it. Why do you think the Huns stayed out of the Eastern Empire? They were bribed. The Eastern Empire simply bribed the Huns to stay out. You know, if you show up, we'll give you a bag of gold. Go mess with those people further west. And of course, the Huns were smart enough to understand the west is where they are weak, the east they are still strong. Who is, of course, the best known of these Huns? Who is the best known of them? Attila. 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 He spent much of his prime raiding Western Rome, going where he wanted, taking what he wanted, and generally being the kind of guy we associate with being a big, nasty Hun. The Western Roman Empire finally fell officially in 476 AD. In 476, the Western Empire simply ceased to exist. A Germanic,
what year was
476. A Germanic chief declared himself king of Italy, and that was the end of it for Western Rome. Supposedly, he got all the regalia and sent it to the east and said, you probably need this because I don't. And there we go. Now, the real question we have to ask, though, is, did Rome really fall in 476? And this is where we get into historiography, because according to Edward Gibbon, that's the end of Rome. Rome fell in 476, it ceases to exist. And if you are taking a Eurocentric or a Western approach, he's certainly correct. That being said, Rome most definitely did not fall in 476. Okay, Rome continued being Rome. It was now just primarily centered in the East. It is still very big. It is still very powerful. As a matter of fact, we now understand that when Western Rome did fall in 476, the Eastern Emperor probably didn't make much hay of it anyway. You know, he was already expecting it, and it really wasn't that big of a deal to him because the West was really just a shell of itself and had been for several years. And so the fall of the Western Roman Empire really is more of a border adjustment than it is the fall of Rome, if we're going to be pragmatic about it. And it is worth noting, in the next 100 years, Eastern emperors are going to reconquer much of the Western Roman Empire. There's going to be some Eastern emperors that go in and take it all back. And one historian that I remember discussing this with back in grad school pointed out that the Eastern conquest of the former Western Empire was really far more destructive than the Germans and the Huns conquering it to begin with. You know, the battles and the fighting and the warfare that the East engaged in to try to take this back was just horrific, you know, because the Eastern Empire, you know, Justinian and Heraclius and the others could not fathom the idea of Western Rome being in the hands of these barbarians, and really they should have just let it go. You know, it's just, it wasn't worth holding on to, and more destruction was done by them than by the original conquerors. So did Rome really fall in 476? Not really. You know, Rome continued. The borders are going to continue to shift. Rome doesn't actually fall for another 100 years when the Ottomans conquer the Eastern Empire. That being said, we will no longer call this the Roman Empire. Just to keep things consistent with how historians have been, it is now the Byzantine. It will now be called the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, continues for another 1,000 years. It continues for another 1,000 years. And like I said, there will be times when the Byzantine Empire looks an awful lot like the Rome that we know of. You know, the Mediterranean will be dominated by the Byzantine Empire depending on which era we're talking about. So there we have it. What we're really getting into is historiography. You know, how do we interpret history? We know the events, and then now we're placing the significance. Earlier historians would have said 476 is a watershed event. Modern historians say, not so much. This is more of what the Huns would have looked like. You know, you get the idea. The Romans did not think well of them. Let's talk about Christianity. Let's talk about Christianity. And discuss how Christianity is going to impact Rome. And we only have a few minutes, so most of this you're gonna pick up on your own, okay? Because we are having our exam on Wednesday. Y'all know that, right? And so this is in the notes, so I want you to study this a little bit more. But Christianity, of course, begins and is centered around the life of Christ, although there really isn't any primary historical evidence that he existed, much less that he lived the life that is described in the New Testament. For our purposes, we will decide that he was a real person because he's too influential for us to not assume that he at least lived. Now, the Christian church takes a very different position based on these teachings than the worldview of the Romans. You know, the Christian church is going to argue, based on, you know, Christ's teaching, that we are all equal, that we're all supposed to support each other, that we're all supposed to love each other, that the poor, the disabled, the dispossessed do in fact matter. And the Christian church is the first church to really come along to push this message. When we talk about the development of religion, this is the first time we not only have monotheism, but we have a degree of compassion that we just don't find in other ancient religions. Now, Christianity itself was constructed by a man named Paul. Paul or Saul. The legend teaches that Paul was not Jewish, as Christ and the early Christians were. Paul was, in fact, from present-day Turkey, and he comes along after Jesus was crucified. Now, you don't have to go to Sunday school to know the basic story of Jesus. You know, he's this Jewish rabbi who is seen as a threat by the authorities, both the Jewish leadership and the Roman authorities in this part of the world. And of course, as a threat to their power, they murdered him. They crucified him as a traitor, as a man engaging in treason. The early Christians saw him as the Messiah who has emerged to redeem the Jews. Paul builds on this concept and argues that Christianity is for everyone, that argues that the Christian church is actually there for all people, not just the Jews or the descendants of the Hebrews, and that all humans are born with the original sin of Adam, and accepting Christ and being baptized and becoming a Christian redeems you in the eyes of God and opens the door for you to be saved, for you to enter heaven and the glory of the afterlife. Much like Christ was seen as a threat to the local authorities in the Jerusalem region, Christians are seen as a threat to the Roman leadership, because the Christian doctrine teaches that the lowliest of slaves is every bit as important as the most powerful of patricians. And if you are living in a very rigidly hierarchical society, you don't want slaves getting ideas. And early Christianity most definitely spread among the poor, among the slaves, among the dispossessed. And it gradually filtered its way up. It was a bottom-starting religion that moved its way up into the middle classes and eventually the upper classes. We believe that the people most responsible for spreading Christianity throughout Rome were probably women more than men, because women tend to feel dispossessed even if they are members of the upper classes. You know, even if you are the wife of a wealthy patrician, it's still a man's world you're living in. You know, and so it's that issue that's going to make Christianity appeal to women. There are legends and stories of Christians being fed to lions in the Colosseums and things of that nature. To tell you the truth, there isn't any direct evidence that Christians were forced to do that sort of thing, that, you know, putting them in the Colosseums as victims is more apocryphal than real. Although, given how we know Christians were persecuted, it's probably true. You know, it probably happened, but it isn't as direct in terms of evidence as we think. Early Christians worshipped in catacombs. Which are the underground cemeteries that we find in ancient cities. There are the underground cemeteries that we find in ancient cities. You see, you can't bury your dead outside the city because we need that land to grow the food. And so when people die in cities, if they are of any importance, we would dig these big areas, these big crypts under the city, because that's a nice, convenient place to dispose of the human bodies without having to take up our farmland. And the reasons Christians would worship in catacombs, and here's some early Christian iconography in these ancient catacombs, is because catacombs are pretty dark, dank, creepy places, and if you're being persecuted, the authorities ain't gonna go there. I mean, hanging out with old Skeletor here isn't exactly my idea of a Friday night. And so if you worship in the catacombs, you're going to be left alone. And so the Christians, being a persecuted group, worshiping in the catacombs, sheltering from the Roman authorities is an image of early Christianity that sticks until the present day. But as I mentioned earlier, Christianity is becoming stronger. It is becoming bigger. The more it is persecuted, the more it grows. And by the 4th century, Christianity is the dominant religion in Rome. There are more Christians in Rome than any other religious faith. And this is the second move that Constantine made. Constantine divided the empire into two. The second move that he made was making peace with the Christian church. He understood, I need these people's help. If Rome is to survive, I need to associate. I thought I told you all to turn your phones off. If Rome is to survive, I need their help. By the time of Constantine, there are wealthy Christians, there are powerful Christians, there are Christians in leadership positions. And even though Christianity is still officially persecuted, for the most part, it is openly supported now. And so Constantine tried to make this alliance between Rome and the Christian church, hoping that the church would support Rome. The extent to which it did is certainly debatable. Constantine will be the first Roman emperor to become a Christian himself. Constantine will become the first emperor to become a Christian, even though it was on his deathbed, and the extent to which he really believed is subject to debate. Nevertheless, it counts. After Constantine, Roman emperors will be expected to be Christians. And Christianity will eventually become the official religion of Rome. And then the Christians start persecuting the non-Christians, which I guess is how humans are. We got another problem, and we're going to mention it very quickly. By the 4th century, we also see divisions within the Christian church. It is a big organization at this point, and we're starting to see different versions of what Christians believe, different stories of the faith, different tales of what Jesus said and what he didn't say. Some people are arguing that this is how he lived. Others are arguing that this is how he lived. And so in 313, down here near Constantinople, a big council was called the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea. And church leaders from all around the empire, met and sorted out what Christians are actually supposed to believe. They came up with a unified statement of faith and belief to make sure that we don't see our religion spread into different categories. We got to keep it all unified was the idea. And they came up with what is called the Nicene Creed, if some of you are familiar with that. It is also believed, although again not confirmed, but generally believed that it is from the Council of Nicaea that we see the emergence of the New Testament. Because during the 4th century, we start to see versions of the New Testament emerge that match modern versions, or at least are close enough. The books are out of order, but the text is more or less the same. Now, what was the early language of the church? These earliest versions of the New Testament that date to the 4th century, what language are they written in? Greek. They're written in Greek because Greek is the language of the upper classes. Greek is the language of the educated people. And so the early Christian church, once all this stuff starts getting written down, it's going to write it all in Greek. And to this day, the Eastern version of the Christian church is called the Greek Orthodox Church. You've probably heard that term before. And it isn't the Greek Orthodox Church because of the nation of Greece. It's the Greek Orthodox Church because of the language that the church uses. And the Western church will eventually develop the Latin language because Latin is the language of Western world. Now, there is much more to this. I haven't given you everything. I've only touched the high points in the 10 minutes that we had to talk about this. And so the rest is for you to pick up on your own in the notes that I posted. We will be having our exam on Wednesday, as I discussed. Did I talk about the essay topics?
Yes.
Except for Rachel. Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. Who, what, when, where, why, and how of the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. And the transition of Rome from republic to empire. The who, what, when, where, why, and how of how Rome goes from a republic to an empire. And I'm talking about Caesar and Mark Antony and Octavian and all that fun stuff. So there are events, names, dates associated with that, and you're welcome to get in touch with me if you want to talk about it. All right, y'all take care. I'll see everybody on Wednesday. Be ready to take exam 2.